Hello and welcome to a windy Westminster where we face the greatest political crisis of our age. Now, as the Prime Minister can neither govern nor call an election, I'll ask him what on earth can he do? Having begged for an election, Labour tonight says not now. I'll ask the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, what his party is playing at. And Anushka Asthana, as usual, will make sense of all this chaos. Good luck, Anushka. Watcher, now politics as we know it is disintegrating before our eyes. Since you and I last spoke, the new Prime Minister has defied all convention by saying he'll shut down Parliament for 5 weeks to stop MPs derailing his plan to take us out of the EU on the 31st of October, do or die. But MPs, led by the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, got their revenge by taking control of Parliament and starting a process that may force Boris Johnson to ask the EU's leaders to delay Brexit, which he says he simply can't do. And then Boris Johnson got his revenge by purging his party of 21 rebels, most of them former ministers, who include perhaps the most famous and the longest-serving Tory MP, Ken Clarke, and Churchill's grandson, Nicholas Soames. Boris Johnson knows he is the lamest of lame ducks. He wants a general election on the 15th of October, but after 2 years of pleading for an election, Jeremy Corbyn tonight blocked Johnson's attempt to call one. We have a government that can't govern, but we can't get a new one. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, but it does feel as though pretty much everything is falling apart. Do you have anything to calm my nerves, Anushka?
I'm all out of remedies, Robert. I thought there was this one cartoon that quite nicely summed up the week. Politicians saying one thing and thinking another. According to this, Boris Johnson really doesn't want an election, except that he does, and Corbyn really does, except that he doesn't. So what is really going on? Let's have a look at some of their political strategies, starting with Boris Johnson. For a man who says he doesn't want an election, he looks very much like he is preparing for one, with his Chancellor, Sajid Javid, offering what looks suspiciously like pre-election giveaways today. As for this huge fight with MPs, he probably doesn't mind that because it helps him frame said election as the people versus the Parliament. Then there is Jeremy Corbyn, a man who's been desperate for an election, as you said, Robert, but didn't vote for one tonight. Why? Well, he sees this as a possible trap that could result in the country leaving the EU without a deal, or in his words, it's a bit like the offer of an apple to Snow White from a wicked queen. It contains the poison of no deal. Now, there are differences in Labour that I'll come to later. The opposition parties all backed Jeremy Corbyn today against the election, but Nicola Sturgeon from the SNP saying it's starting to feel like Labour doesn't want an election at all. She's really pushing for one as soon as this legislation becomes law. The Lib Dems want to wait a lot longer than that. And as for Nigel Farage, well, he is ready for one any time. He's really up for it. I just want to finish with a thing that I think shows you why we're definitely going to get one pretty soon, and it is this brilliant graph of the week. The Tories reducing majority on a picture of the lounging Jacob Rees-Mogg. Robert.
Thanks, Anushka. Well, that certainly was the image of the last couple of days. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by my trio of the purged. Dominic Grieve, you have actually been purged by Boris Johnson. Salma Shah used to work for Sajid Javid, and you purged yourself. And I think Jeremy Corbyn's always trying to find a way to purge you. He's resisted so far. But Dominic, if I could start with you. I mean, really remarkable couple of days. I genuinely never thought I'd see the day when a Tory Prime Minister would effectively sack so many MPs who've given extraordinarily loyal service, including Ken Clarke, Nick Soames, yourself. What does this mean for the future of your party?
Looks pretty bleak to me. We're a broad church party. Our success has always been based on pragmatism, having a wide and divergent views tolerated within the party. And take an example, Bill Cash, who's been in the party for years and is a serial rebel. Jacob Rees-Mogg is a serial rebel. He's rebelled about 80, 90 times in the course of his career. Nobody's ever suggested withdrawing the whip or deselecting him. So this is a most unusual lurch, which seems to introduce an ideological note. certainly has had, I think, a very bad impact on the party in Parliament. I don't know about the party in the country, because I note a lot of colleagues who were not purged, who are very unhappy about what's happened, and done in a very strange fashion. I mean, I might say that until now, nobody's actually told me I've had the whip withdrawn. But
everybody else have. Why have they forgotten
I have
about
no
you?
idea. They must have forgotten me. I mean, I do know it's happened because I've been sort of
I
taken
tell you
off
they haven't forgotten, because whenever I
WhatsApp
talk to
groups
Downing
and
Street,
removed.
you're regarded as the chief villain. So I don't think they've completely forgotten.
Maybe they found me so toxic they didn't want to come near me and tell me about it.
But what about your seat, though? Where are you as regards your own
Clearly,
members?
as a deselected MP, in the sense of having had the whip withdrawn, I'm not eligible to be adopted for my constituency any more than Philip Hammond is.
Will you run in the next election?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it depends a little bit about when the election takes place, but I certainly take the view that if it's taking place in the atmosphere of crisis that we have at the moment, with the issues unresolved in relation to Brexit, I think I'd be shortchanging my constituents if I didn't actually offer myself. Whether they'll elect me is another matter. But if I didn't stand as an independent and say, this is what I believe in, and this is why I took the decisions I did, and if you want to endorse me, you can, and if you don't, you can go and vote for whoever new Conservative candidate is selected.
And just to be clear, but I obviously want to move on to our other guests in a second, but just to be clear, it's only when it comes to Brexit that you feel, in a way, the party has moved away from you. You're not like Philip Lee, who now thinks the Liberal Democrats are closer to his general views.
There's no doubt that linked into Brexit, there is an ideological element that hasn't been present in its current form. You've got to understand that if you believe in a hard Brexit, then I think you logically believe in a future for the United Kingdom which is deregulated, low tariffs, low tax, and low welfare payments. Now, personally, I think this is a completely unattainable fantasy, because I don't believe the UK electorate have any interest in these things whatsoever. But there's no doubt that some of my colleagues in Parliament are animated by this. In fact, it is the only possible way in which you can justify Brexit now, because the truth is that Brexit, as we found during the 3.5 years in the negotiations, there is no form of Brexit that is better than staying in the EU. And the problem is that some of my colleagues then look at this and say, well, that's so unacceptable because we've got to leave. Therefore, they go for more and more extreme types of departure. And clearly, if that is the direction of travel they want, we will end up ultimately no longer being the party that we were in the past.
Dominic, I'll come back to you in a minute, but Jess, many people watching will not understand why a Labour Party that has literally spent more than 2 years begging for a general election has tonight not voted for one.
Well, I mean, it is baffling. I can totally understand that. But the reality is that the person asking for that general election is also the person who's gone all around the country saying he didn't want a general election. And we cannot trust that Boris Johnson, I wouldn't trust him about anything, but we cannot trust that he is doing anything other than to force a no deal. And yes, maybe we look like fools, but you know what? I'd rather look like a fool and protect my constituents' jobs. I genuinely, that is the dividing line for me. And Boris Johnson, the only way he can get out of the fact that he went around like a big bravado saying he could get a better deal, now he realises he can't get any deal. He's doing no negotiating at all. He's got nothing to offer. He's got nothing to tell people like Dominic that they could vote for him by way of a deal. Nothing at all. And yet he's trying to get himself out of it. I'm not going to help him.
Now, some of the other thing which has been remarkable over the last few weeks is we've seen what some have characterised, Margot James, for example, former Minister in the House, as a government actually run by Boris Johnson's most senior aide, Dominic Cummings, rather than by Boris Johnson himself. Is Dominic Cummings' power as great, in your view, as people like Margot James says?
I think it's undeniable that he is a massive influence on government, not just because...
And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it depends on how much the Prime Minister allows him to take charge of certain issues and how much the buck stops with Dominic Cummings and how much it stops with the Prime Minister.
And where do you think it stops at the moment? Do you think it stops with the Prime Minister, or do you think it stops with Dominic Cummings?
I think it has to stop with the Prime Minister.
No, I know you're saying you would like it, but I'm saying in practice what's happening?
In practice, because I'm not in Downing Street, at the moment. It doesn't. I can't comment on whether it does or it doesn't. But from
But
the
you
outside,
understand the concerns of Margot James.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And the reason I'm being a bit reluctant about it is that actually it needs to be tested in a way. And the fact that they've tried to call a general election and failed actually does test the person who's coming up with this strategy behind the scenes. We've seen this once before 2017, when we had Theresa May, who seemed to be dominated by her advisors, and it's not a great look.
Look, so much more to talk about with all of you. As it happens, a few minutes ago, I spoke to the Prime Minister in his office in the House of Commons, and I began by asking him if he might as well pack it in, as he's lost 4 votes in just 2 days, more than most Prime Ministers lose in years.
Well, actually, it's been a very good day. If you look at what we did today, we had a huge spending round announcement. Sajid Javid, the Chancellor, set out the biggest package of spending since, I think, 2002, which is the moment when the Blair government really decided to start investing in hospitals and schools, and we're doing the same. Big package for hospitals, 20,000 police on the street, as you know, levelling up education funding across the country. Those are for every primary, every secondary school. I think those are the priorities of the British people, and we're delivering on them here in Parliament. Yes, I can, before you interrupt me, it is absolutely true that Brexit continues to obsess our beloved colleagues, and we've got the most peculiar situation tonight, which is that I think for the first time in democratic history, first time in the history of this country, the leader of the opposition has actually declined the offer of a general election, and that's what he's paid to do. That's what the opposition is meant to do. They're meant to contest elections against the government. I can only speculate as to why he has chosen not to have a general election. The reason I don't want one particularly, let me explain, I don't want a general election at all.
But you can't govern. If you lose 4 votes in 2 days, you need a general election.
The truth is that we've had our chance to get a deal in Brussels on Brexit really badly damaged, if not totally wrecked, by the surrender bill.
But why does a senior colleague, actually former senior colleague like Philip Hammond, just say you're straightforwardly wrong about that, that your negotiating position hasn't suffered at all?
Well, unfortunately, it totally wrecks it, because what it does, if you read the bill, what it does, the thing that was passed today, is it compels me as Prime Minister to write a letter. In fact, it writes the letter for me that I have to send to Brussels. I just have to add my signature saying I request an extension to stay in the EU. And it then gives the EU the power to decide how long the UK must remain in the EU. Now, that's a quite incredible thing.
But you yourself say you don't want you don't want a no deal Brexit. You'd much rather get a deal.
Absolutely.
Your own Attorney General said to you, if you insist on taking out the backstop, it is no deal. So your own Attorney General is wrong, is he?
Well, you were at Biarritz and you've been seeing what's been happening, Robert, over the last few weeks. Actually, we've been making a huge amount of progress in other European capitals. And the fascinating thing is that whereas at the beginning of August, everybody said across the EU that you couldn't change one dot or comma of the withdrawal agreement, I think all the other 27 basically accept that it has to be changed. The question is how. And what we've been getting across to colleagues is that there are 2 broad areas of discussion, and they involve, the facilitations that you need to check things away from the Northern Irish border, to control goods flowing from Northern Ireland to the Republic, but away from, and vice versa, but away from the border. Then there's a more conceptual approach, which involves trying to look at the economic unity of the island of Ireland, whilst allowing the whole UK, complete with Northern Ireland, politically and economically, to come out of the EU. Now, that is the way forward. And what's sad about what's happened in the last few days is that our chance to make a huge amount of progress, come out of the so-called backstop, the thing that keeps us in the EU's legal order, makes sure that we have to accept the way the EU runs our trade policy. That arrangement we can come out of if I'm given the chance to get a deal. Now, I will get a deal.
But I've got to ask you a couple of quick questions on that, though. Let's give you the benefit of the doubt and say you get a deal. Now, some of your Brexiter MPs say they want more than just removing the backstop, and they couldn't vote for a Brexit deal that was simply Mrs May's deal minus the backstop. Now, but I need to ask you, because there's a parity issue here. If they vote against a deal that you are recommending, will you expel them from the party in the way that you expelled some Remainers from the party last night?
Well, a couple of quick points. The first is that we're not just asking for the the whole withdrawal bill is a bad withdrawal act, the withdrawal treaty, I should say, as signed by the previous, is a terrible treaty. The way to cure it is to get rid of the backstop, but you also have to change the political declaration. You have to rewrite that. Yeah. Now, if you do that,
but there is this parity issue. If you recommend a deal and some of your colleagues won't back it, will they be expelled in the way that Ken Clarke and Nicola Soames were expelled last night?
Sure. I think what the people of this country want to see is a government that is determined to come out of the EU on October the 31st, and that is what we are going to do.
And so, what source
are you going for the goose is sauce for the gander? And that's what I've said to all colleagues, and I think I said it.
So that means that Steve Baker would be out of the party if he can't vote for it.
I think colleagues are going to find that the deal we get is extremely good. I think you're going to find that people will instinctively want to vote for it because it gets us out of the EU. And the real issue now is who is going to get that deal and who can be relied on to secure an exit from the EU. And I'm afraid what we've heard from the leader of the opposition today is not only does he want to cancel the referendum, and not only does he want to extend the UK's membership of the EU at the behest of the EU, giving that power to keep us in potentially for years and years at their own discretion, but also he now refuses, contrary to what I think is the constitutional duty of a leader of the opposition, he refuses to take part in a general election. And I don't think I've never known a time in modern history when the leader of the opposition has refused to participate in an election. I can only invite our viewers, Robert, to speculate as to why he may be so disinclined.
They will be speculating.
Does somebody need to get out the chicken suit? That is my question.
I think the chicken suit's for another day, because I've got another two very, very quick questions. I know we're almost out of time. One is, are you confident that you will get your general election before the EU Council?
On that, I mean, back to where we were, I think that the Labour Party and indeed the Scottish Nationalists, who also seem to be against trusting the people with an election, I think they're going to find themselves steadily in an unsustainable...
Because you can't enjoy not having the numbers to do anything. Are you going to be a permanent lame duck? We've talked about chickens. Are you going to be a permanent lame duck, or will you get your general election?
I think that the position of the Labour Party, to be so consumed by cowardice as to resist a general election, is not politically sustainable.
And then very finally...
That's my view.
A Brexiter, Sir Edward Lee, said today he's deeply uncomfortable with what he called the purging of colleagues. I mean, Ken Clarke, probably the best known, certainly the longest serving Tory MP, held a whole variety of cabinet posts. You wrote a biography of Winston Churchill. He was his grandfather. Most people think there is something spectacularly odd about...
Well, I think what most...
about, distinguished Tories like that being thrown out.
Yeah, and look, I mean, these are friends of mine, and believe me, I take absolutely no joy in any of it. But it was very sad and surprising that they should choose to undermine the UK's ability to get a deal. Because that's what it does. That's what it does. And I think what the country wants to see is clarity and determination in coming out of the EU on October the 31st. And alas, for those colleagues who had plenty of warning and explication about what we want, they were, I'm afraid, backing a bill, the surrender bill, that effectively frustrates Brexit. And we made it very clear to them what the consequences would be.
But it is but you are running a new kind of Tory party, aren't you?
No, not at all.
This is unprecedented.
No, it's just that we have a clear mandate from the people to deliver Brexit, and that, I'm afraid, Parliament has refused to honour that for more than 3 years. So we've got to get it done.
Prime Minister, good to see you.
Thank you.
So, gosh, quite a fair amount to chew over there. Jess, if I could just start with you. Why does this date of the election matter so much? You don't think the election should be until after October the 31st. Why is that?
I don't think that this is a game. Our country is at genuine risk, and my constituents' livelihoods, lots of them work in the car industry, are at genuine risk. And this is
But
a
just to
game
be clear,
I wanna play with Boris
even
Johnson.
if the election is after October the 31st, you cannot guarantee that there won't be a no-deal Brexit. Because, I mean, Boris Johnson will fight an election on taking us out of the EU at a moment's notice whenever the election is held. And in practice, most people think that means he will be campaigning on a ticket effectively of a no-deal Brexit. You can't stop that, whatever the date.
Of course I can't, but at the moment, what we're faced with in Parliament is a precarious cliff edge, and I have to, each day, look at what is presented to me and try on that day to do what is best for my constituents.
But why is the
I'm not
cliff
going
edge,
to-
worse on October the 31st than on November the 5th or November the 15th? Why do you care whether it's a matter of a week or 2 weeks or a month?
Because I think that Boris Johnson has got to go and try and get a deal with the European Union.
But he's never going to do that.
Yes, but he shouldn't have gone around the country during the Tory leadership election saying, I'm the big man, I'm much better than that last woman, I can definitely get a deal. He needs to hang on this hook and show the country that this is difficult. And actually a leader, a real leader, would say, do you know what, sometimes I've got this wrong and this is really, really difficult and maybe we need to look for consensus. But he didn't show consensus this week. He acted like a bully and he got rid of some really decent members of Parliament.
But look, what he would say, and he repeatedly says, since he hasn't got the kind of nuanced, sophisticated negotiating strategy you think that he should have, that he has only one negotiating tactic, which is to threaten a no deal. And what you're saying is, broadly, you want to take that away from him so that if he goes into an election, that's all he's going to be offering.
Even on the issue
and that can't be something that appeals to you.
Even on the issue of no deal, Boris Johnson is looking both ways. On one hand, he's saying, don't worry, it's all Operation Fear and nothing bad is going to happen. And on the other, it says it's so bad that the European Union will literally bend over and let me do anything.
Now, unfortunately, I've just got to go back to Anushka, and I'm going to come back to both of you in just a moment or two. Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. I just want to pick up on that point that you're discussing there, the idea of the timing of an election, because Labour have been pretty much united against no deal and against backing Boris Johnson's snap election tonight. But as you can already see there are disagreements in the party around when is the right time to push for an election. Look at this. We've had headlines like this, Keir Starmer clashing with Jeremy Corbyn over the timing, a suggestion that Corbyn wants to go earlier than Starmer. We know that there was a big meeting of Labour MPs today that Starmer was at, where many people in the room were saying to him, like Jess, please can we wait until after October the 31st? And there was applause. I've also spoken to some senior shadow cabinet members who hold that same position, but they say Corbyn is the leader and he must have the final say, and he did appear to have that tonight. As Henry Zeffman from The Times has tweeted, Corbyn just said at the dispatch box that once the extension bill has royal assent, he'll back an election. Well, that could be as early as Monday. Henry adds lots of his MPs will be unhappy with that. I think just one thing to quickly look at is who wants an election, and the people who want an election are not the Brexit Party. Look at this, 77% in blue don't want an election. It's not the Tories, it's not Leave voters, but it is Remainers, It is Lib Dems, and it certainly is Labour, 63%. Robert.
That's an issue. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by John McDonnell. When do you think the general election should be held?
We've got a number of objectives. I'll try and be as clear as I can. Our first objective is preventing a no-deal Brexit. So we've got this legislation going through now.
And the Prime Minister said he's going to oppose it, but nonetheless, it looks as though in the end he'll have to accept it. Jeremy Corbyn said tonight that if he accepts it, you will then go for a general election. So the issue of the date then arises.
That's it. We want to get this legislation through because it will help us protect against a no-deal Brexit. It will ensure that Parliament either agrees a deal or votes on a no-deal Brexit, or also can extend. So it maintains the flexibility to hold the Prime Minister to account. What we want to do is, once we've got the security of that legislation through, then what we want is the security of determining when that election is and what date that will be.
What's your own preference?
Well, my own preference at the moment is most probably later rather than sooner, but that...
Well, what does that mean? Do you mean after October the 31st?
We're talking to people at the moment on that, and it's all about the security of preventing a no-deal Brexit. The reason we couldn't support the motion tonight to bring about a general election is it would hand the date of the general election to the Prime Minister. And there is a real lack of trust in Boris Johnson. He has a passing and maybe a fleeting relationship with the truth sometimes.
But just to be clear, I think your personal view, I think you just said to me, right now, I allow you to change your view, but your personal view at the moment appears to be that the date must be after October the 31st.
Not necessarily.
Ah.
What we need to do, and we're consulting about this at the moment.
Who are you consulting?
Party members, the PLP members and others. We want to try and see whether or not, yes, there can be a negotiated deal at the European Council. So that's obviously a key date. And it's around that period, I think, that most people are thinking, well, at that stage, maybe a general election to be called. But we're trying to make...
Sorry, just when you say be called, you mean polling day would be around the time of the EU Council?
Either that or called. We're just genuinely consulting people, because the key issue for us, look, I desperately want a general election. But I want the security of preventing a no deal as well. Now, if this legislation goes through...
But realistically, John, you know this. You can't prevent a no deal. All that this legislation does is it forces whoever is Prime Minister to go to the EU and say, can we have an extension? Now, there are two problems, it seems to me, with that. One is the EU could simply say, what's the extension for? And at the moment, we don't really have a very clear answer on that. But secondly, Boris Johnson can campaign in a general election.
What it does also,
for a no-deal Brexit, whatever the date is.
What it also does, it mandates the Prime Minister to go off and negotiate a deal that will be decided by Parliament itself, or Parliament vote for a no deal. So in other words, it does mean we have democratic control of that Prime Minister.
I'm going to come back to you, but you are saying something which many of your colleagues would regard as incredible, which is you appear to be implying that you think Boris Johnson can negotiate a deal that the Labour Party would support.
No, it means that Parliament will have control of the process, because we can't trust this Prime Minister. That's what this legislation
I'll tell you what, let's
about.
explore this in a bit more detail in a moment or two. Please don't go away, because much more from John McDonnell and my other brilliant guests in just a few minutes. Welcome back. I'm delighted John McDonnell is still with me. John, before the break, we were talking about the importance for you of the election being after the EU Council. I'm not sure I fully understand why that makes such a difference, given that whenever the election is, Boris Johnson will be campaigning on a platform of an almost immediate Brexit. Most people will see that as a no-deal Brexit. He could still win whenever the date.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the interview this evening that you've just shown, he was arguing he was negotiating a new deal, and that we were cutting off his legs to enable that to happen. Let's take him at face value. He's saying he's negotiating a deal. Let's see the evidence of that. For us,
But he says you are taking away his leverage.
No,
that if he can't
ludicrous.
threaten no deal, he's got no leverage.
that's ludicrous. The real issue is actually, from what we know now, is that he's not put any proposals to our EU partners in all the time he's been supposedly negotiating. But we're trying to hold him. The whole point of the legislation today was to hold the government to account, so that the Prime Minister would either have to come back to Parliament with a deal or present to Parliament a vote on a no deal, and part of that is, yes, about securing an extension if necessary. It's all about just holding the Prime Minister to account. If we'd have voted for his general election proposal tonight, he would have been able to gone off and set whenever date he wanted for a general election, and he could have set that actually after October 31st and forced us into a no-deal Brexit.
But he would say that you are depriving the British people of a proper choice.
Right.
If
Let's go through it then.
If the election is after the EU Council.
Right. What we're trying to do is to ensure the British people do have a proper choice. That's why, actually, having one after the European Council means that they will be able to consider whatever deal is negotiated or no deal itself. The key issue here is trying to ensure that the Prime Minister is held to account and what he's actually telling us. He's telling us he can negotiate a deal. Let's see what he comes up with and then go to the British people, or if not, he can put a no deal to the British people.
So it sounds to me that if this bill that's currently being debated in the House of Lords receives royal assent by Monday, most people think it will, at that point you would be prepared to vote under the Fixed Term Parliament Act for a general election on Monday, so long as you get a guarantee of a date.
No, under the Fixed Term Parliament, I'm sorry this is complicated, under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, you could not secure an agreement with the government on a date that would hold.
Okay.
Because it's done.
So how are you going to do it?
Well, there's another route.
Right.
That if the government comes back with an amendment to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, a one-line bill or whatever, that we may be able to amend to insert a date into it.
Right.
That may give us that guarantee. But
are you making that offer to Boris Johnson now, that if he does that on Monday,
No.
you will vote for a general election?
What we're doing at the moment, we're exploring with our lawyers and constitutional experts how can we get that security. Because we're dealing with, and I don't want to be in any way personal or disrespectful, but we're dealing with someone who, as I say, has a passing relationship with the truth.
Sounds quite personal.
And well, I'm sorry, that's the way he's behaved over the years. So we can't trust him on these matters in the normal way you would with other parties.
But just to be clear, it does sound to me, it's not exactly an olive branch to Boris Johnson, but it does sound to me that you are open for a negotiation so long as you can specify the date of the general election.
You can't negotiate with Boris Johnson. To negotiate with someone, you have to have some element of trust. You can't. What we're looking for is a mechanism in which Parliament itself can secure a way through this. And part of securing that way through this is, if we are to have a general election at some date in the future, that Parliament has some element of control over that date.
All right.
In terms of that relationship.
Look, you've been in this game a long time. When do you think the general election will be?
I think, as I said, later rather than sooner, because I don't think people want something before the European Council, and it may well be beyond that.
But not much beyond it, from what you're really saying.
Well, I don't think so. If it goes into October, I wouldn't think it would be much beyond that. But we're consulting, and the good thing of what's happening in Parliament at the moment is MPs across party are talking to one another, and this is parliamentary democracy taking control.
And then finally, because obviously this is something of enormous concern to many of your MPs, as and when there is an election, if Boris Johnson is still leader of the Tory party, it looks as though he will be, he will campaign on a very simple platform of an almost immediate Brexit, right? Whatever date the election is, that will be his platform. Your platform at the moment is not to remain in the EU, which would be a simple alternative. It is a referendum.
Let the people decide.
Let the people decide. Now, do you honestly believe that the British people want two such momentous votes in such quick succession? Aren't you effectively committing electoral suicide by saying, if Labour is elected, there's yet another vote?
I think there's a mood in the country now where people, they've had enough. There's fatigue over this issue. But I actually think people want to come together again now. I think they've had enough.
So you're not uncomfortable with your party's position referendum, and not even at this stage specifying whether you would back Remain or a different kind of Brexit.
I think I said I would campaign for Remain, but I want to be in a position where we offer the people the final say, and in that way we can bring the people back together again. It's the easiest thing in the world to be a populist politician like Boris Johnson and go to the extremes, but actually what we need in this country at the moment, we need people coming back together again. I think we can offer that.
Honestly, I'm not sure it's easy being any kind of politician at the moment, if I'm completely frank with you. But as always, great to see you again, John. Come back soon. Don't go away, because after the break, we'll be talking to another influential player in Westminster, the SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford. Welcome back. Well, I've got more from my distinguished panel of rebels in just a moment, but first I'm going to talk to the Scottish National Party's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford. Ian, good evening to you.
Good evening, Robert.
So where do you think we stand tonight on prospects for a general election, and what is the SNP's position?
Well, we want a general election, but the first thing that we need to do, Robert, is to make sure that we secure the legislation that we've brought to the Commons today. It has to complete its passage in the House of Lords, and it has to be given royal assent. We need to make sure that we remove, in the first instance, that threat of leaving the European Union at the end of October. And there's an instruction that Parliament is giving to the Prime Minister that he needs to go to Brussels and he needs to make sure that we get that extension. So that's the first thing.
Can I ask you on that? John McDonnell, Labour's Shadow Chancellor, has just said to me that in his view, he's not saying that his party will in the end do this, but in his view, the election date should be after that EU Council. Do you agree with him on that?
Well, I think there are many things that we need to consider. We need to look at any traps that the Prime Minister may lay for us, and I think it's important that opposition parties meet and discuss that. And I have to say, over the course of the last few weeks, that's been happening. I want to commend everyone for the spirit in which these talks have taken place. But we need to game out just exactly what the risks are, because I know John said, and I would agree with him, that we can't trust this Prime Minister. He's prepared to trash democracy. And let's not forget that the reason that this is being rushed through this week is because the Prime Minister wants to shut down Parliament next week. He wants to stop our ability to hold the government to account and to give that direction to the government. So we need to find a way of ending Boris Johnson's premiership of the United Kingdom. I think there's a shared interest that we all have in doing that. I suppose...
Can I just sort of press you on one point, Ian? I mean, you have a massive conflict of interest because you know that if Boris Johnson is heading for a no-deal Brexit, the SNP's prospects of getting Scotland out of the UK improve, because a no-deal Brexit is probably less popular in Scotland than it is anywhere else. So actually, it's deep in your heart, you quite want a no-deal Brexit, don't you?
Robert, I can assure you, absolutely not. I understand why you would put the question that way, but we don't want any part of the United Kingdom to suffer from a no-deal Brexit. I don't want people to lose their job.
Very generous of you.
Well, no, but I think we all have an interest in this, and frankly, Scotland would have an economic impact from a no-deal Brexit, so we must work collectively across party to stop it. And that's what I said in the House this evening, that we would do that. There has to be that spirit of cooperation. Look, we may end up in a circumstance over the course of the coming days that we find a mechanism that we're prepared to coalesce around that will result in the calling of an election in the short period. What will happen is if Parliament does prorogue next week and an election's not been called, we come back on the 14th of October, we have a Queen's speech. Now, what I do think is absolutely the case is there is no chance of this government getting a Queen's speech through. It will fall, and there would have to be a motion of no confidence on that basis. So come what may, a general election will be called over the course of the coming weeks. I welcome that. I welcome the opportunity that we will have to put our case to the people of Scotland. But working with colleagues, we'll work out what is in the best interests of all the parts of the United Kingdom and the timing of that election.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. Very final question to you. I just spoke to Boris Johnson. He called both you and Jeremy Corbyn chickens. Do you want to offer any kind of response?
You know, I've been amazed by Boris's behaviour in the chamber over the course of the last couple of days and the language he's used. He's talked about MPs surrendering to the European Union, the fact that we're collaborators. I have to say this is a man that's not worthy of the role of Prime Minister because he doesn't know how to behave. I think what we're trying to do in Parliament is recognise the interest that we have of all our constituents of working together and stopping no deal. Boris really ought to start to grow up and show some dignity of the office of Prime Minister.
Lovely to talk to you. See you again soon, I hope. Now, I just want to pick up, as I say, with my rebel crew. I'm going to start with you, Sama. What Ian Blackford just said, which is, you know, if there isn't a general election, we are going to get a Queen's speech, which Boris Johnson no longer has absolutely no chance of getting through Parliament. What on earth does he do? I mean, what does the country do?
Well, I'm afraid this is exactly why Boris Johnson and Number 10 have taken such a hardline approach, because they saw Theresa May grapple with this when she lost her majority, and they didn't want to go down the same route. And by taking the hardline approach, by taking away the whip from Tory rebels, they thought they were going to perhaps cow people into voting the way that they wanted to.
But truthfully, therefore, given that he cannot govern at the moment, he won't be able to negotiate the date he wants, will he? He'll, in the end, have to accept the date that opposition parties force on him for the general election.
It's looking increasingly likely that that's what's going to happen, but it's not necessarily against his interest, especially if he goes to the public again saying the opposition has frustrated Brexit. And the whole strategy is to combine the Leave vote behind him, and it could well work for him in the end.
Dominic, if you could pick an ideal date for the general election, what would it be?
I don't think I have an ideal date, because whilst I recognise that there is in all likelihood going to be a general election in the late autumn, I certainly agree that the political parties, the opposition parties, would be crazy to allow it to happen until the date of extension to the 31st of January has been secured. We actually have that as an international treaty. So I recognise that once that's happened, there is likely to be a general election.
But why should the EU give us till the end of January if we are unable, which we won't be able to say, what that extension is for?
Well, I think they will, partly because they don't wish us to crash out, and certainly if it looks likely that there's going to be a general election, I'm sure that they will wait for that democratic event to take place. Now, my reservation is I do worry that this democratic event, a general election, will not deliver any clarity. And that's why I have a preference for a referendum. But I can see that we are probably moving to a general election. What comes out of that mix, I wouldn't wish to predict. I think it's very high risk for Boris Johnson. I think it's very high risk for Jeremy Corbyn.
But there isn't really a high risk for Boris Johnson because, you know, he can't govern. What is the point of being Prime Minister if you can't govern?
The problem he has, and it's also Theresa May's problem, is that they have never thought creatively about a way out of their dilemma. That they have inherited an instruction from the electorate which in practice is incapable of implementation without immense damage to the country. And rather
so what would a creative way out be?
Well, a creative way out, if Theresa May, back in January of this year, in my view, had said, you've blocked my deal, would you, O Parliament, allow me to put this deal to the electorate in a referendum with an alternative of Remain, I think she'd have got it through the House of Commons. And she lost that opportunity. Now, I have to say, I think that opportunity might still just exist for Boris, but it's going day by day.
Do you think that opportunity exists for Boris Johnson?
Yes, I absolutely think that exists for Boris Johnson. And another thing that existed for both of them was to not be frightened about trying to unite the Leave voters.
But just imagine if that referendum happened, and then the British people voted to Remain. His career, perhaps actually the prospects of the Tory party, would be smashed at that point, wouldn't it?
Well, it might, but that's fairly irrelevant. He would go down in history.
It's relevant to you, but it's not irrelevant to Boris Johnson. That's the problem.
I'm sorry, it should be irrelevant to him. He hasn't come into politics for his own self-aggrandisement. He's come in to serve the public.
Absolutely.
This country's got a major crisis, and I get pretty irritated by politicians who are clearly putting their own career prospects and desires in front of what they know to be the right thing to do.
Salma, you've worked closely with these individuals. Do you name a politician currently in the government who will put the country before their personal prospects, please?
But the problem here is that all politicians, especially ones that serve in the government, think that by following the government line, they are trying to put the nation's interests first. And I would just like to say, both of you make very valid points, but how many of your fellow MPs in each of your parties would agree with you on that point, that having put the motion on the deal to the public would actually give you the result that you want? That's very speculative.
The thing is, we don't know whether it'd give us the deal that we want.
But
there
there's
definitely
no point in going
needs
into that counterfactual
Politicians
now.
have tried to wrangle with this very, very difficult question, and we have roundly failed. And actually, I don't just blame the other side. I think, to be honest, there's been a huge amount of failure across the board. I trust the public much more and think that they are the ones. I genuinely think that they can get us out of this. But the reality is that there is that opportunity for Boris Johnson. And what Ian Blackford's just said was, yes, it would be much better, to be honest, for him and what his ultimate cause and for his electoral success, if they even allowed a no-deal Brexit. But he cares about the country. I just cannot say the same thing about the Prime Minister. I feel actually I could have said it about Theresa May. Boris Johnson cares about Boris Johnson, and I don't want to play his game.
In fairness to Boris Johnson, he's not the only politician in history who appears to put his own prospects before others. But anyway, that is it for this week. I've said it before, and I've said it again. This is history, folks. The end of more than a century of how we run this place. What happens next? Join me here in a week to find out. Bye.